When Putin decided to invade Ukraine, one of his main justifications was protecting Ukraine's Russian-speaking population from quote-unquote genocide. But ironically, he's achieved the complete opposite. Now, I'm not talking about genocide against people, but rather the Russian language itself. That's right. As a result of this war, Ukraine has become very motivated to abandon the Russian language as much as possible. So, how exactly do they plan to do this? Well, to understand how, we must first understand the way in which Russian became so widely used in Ukraine in the first place. It's a pretty complicated story, but to sum it up as best as I can, it started all the way back in the late 16th century, when the first waves of Russians settled onto what became Ukrainian territory in the area known as Sloboda Ukraine. More Russians seeped into the northern, central, and eastern territories that are now Ukraine during the 17th century, while the western part was controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at least until the areas were fully partitioned by the Russian Empire in 1795. So by the beginning of the 18th century, the Russian Empire basically owned all of modern-day Ukraine. During all this and through the years, Russian was being promoted as the main language used in Ukraine, through various integration policies to prevent separatism. Russian was made the language of instruction in schools and universities. It became the dominant language of business and trade. There were policies encouraging ethnic Russians to move into Ukrainian strongholds. And soon the influence of Russian literature, media, texts, and art were changing the culture. Even the Russian Orthodox Church was Russifying Ukraine. This of course means though that at the same time, the Russian Empire was actively suppressing the Ukrainian language. The publication of religious and educational texts written in the Ukrainian language were originally banned. This was eventually expanded into basically trying to eliminate the Ukrainian language as a whole at this point. All books, song lyrics, and other written materials in Ukrainian were banned. The staging of plays, recitals, and songs in Ukrainian were banned. The teaching of Ukrainian in school or any educational materials in the language were banned at every level, and the use of Ukrainian in official documents, bureaucracy, and administration were banned. This of course meant that not only was the language being restricted, but it, along with Ukrainian culture, were being portrayed as inferior or peasant-like in official discourses. This slandering led to a situation where even ethnic Ukrainians preferred to speak Russian in formal settings, viewing their native language as less prestigious or refined. So what parents started doing was teaching their kids Russian from day one, with Ukrainian sort of becoming a second language that everyone knew. So Russian became the mother tongue for a lot of Ukrainian kids. This situation lasted until the 1905 Russian Revolution, where some restrictions were lifted, allowing for a cultural revival. Things were getting better even through the establishment of the Soviet Union, but that was until the late 1930s. When leader Joseph Stalin finally cemented his totalitarian control and decided to clamp down on perceived threats of Ukrainian nationalism by promoting Soviet unity heavily. For the next 50 years, the policy of Russification was increasingly intensified. Living there as a non-Russian came with a very simple reality. If you wanted a good job, if you wanted to go to a good school, you had to know Russian. It's sort of like how English is today in a lot of places. This was until the late 1980s, when Ukraine was able to pass the 1989 Law of the Languages, declaring the Ukrainian language the only official language, while all others spoken in Ukraine were guaranteed constitutional protection. Then of course came the dissolution of the USSR and independence of Ukraine in 1991. So since then, it's basically been an upward battle of repealing Russian influence and reviving the culture and language of Ukraine. Even in 2012, around 40% of Ukrainians named Russian as their mother tongue. And keep in mind, the ones that don't are most likely fluent in it. But to be fair, a lot of this is in the south and east of Ukraine, which are Russian strongholds. If we jump to the modern day, Ukraine started seriously trying to erase their Russian history from 2015, when their parliament passed decommunization laws, banning communist propaganda and symbols. This meant that the name of cities, villages, streets, and squares that referred to communist slogans and leaders fell under the ban and had to be changed. Keep in mind too that all of these things were originally named with the Russian language, so they had to be replaced by Ukrainian. In the first year alone, 51,500 streets and 987 cities and villages were renamed with either restoration of their historic names or new names. While at the same time, any information boards in railways and airports written in Russian were replaced too. Then in 2017, a law was passed requiring 75% of all TV channels operating in Ukraine must be in Ukrainian, along with it becoming the only language of official communication in public institutions. And finally, in 2019, the biggest law came into force, known as the Law on Protecting the Functioning of the Ukrainian Language as the State Language. It effectively made Ukrainian obligatory within all aspects of public life, from sports and mass media to political campaigning. It required TV and film distribution firms to ensure 90% of their content is in Ukrainian, and for the proportion of Ukrainian language printed media and books to be at least 50%. So really, Ukraine has been actively trying to get their citizens to speak Ukrainian even recently before the war. But getting the population to stop speaking Russian has been no simple task, and at times has been a source of controversy, given how influential Russian has been in society for literally centuries. It was working though, albeit kinda slowly. Most people in Ukraine are now bilingual in both languages, or can at least understand both of them. But that is all about to possibly change. And that brings us to today. With the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, although one of Putin's motives was to, quote, protect Ukraine's Russian-speaking population, he may very well have doomed the possibility of the language ever being spoken as much as it is now in the next generation. We've all heard about the drone strikes on public places, war crimes, and of course the inescapable death toll of Ukrainians, which US officials put at about 70,000 casualties. And all these things have put an incredible dent on the Ukrainian people's view of Russia, and by extension, the Russian language. What this means is a combination of new, more intense anti-Russian language laws being passed, but also Ukrainian speakers fully deciding to just stop speaking Russian at all. See, for many of them, they are now pained by the Russian language. This one Ukrainian describes it best. My mother tongue tastes like ashes, things scorched by enemy fire, then soaked with rain, touched with rot, smelling of death. Russian is my mother tongue and liberation means ripping it out of my throat. And really, there's more and more examples of this exact feeling. So not only are many bilingual people switching to Ukrainian, but tutoring classes in Ukrainian are exploding with people that need help. On the day Russia invaded Ukraine, Vlada Belozerenko, a Kiev theater director and public speaking coach who grew up speaking Russian, now has about 110,000 people following her on Instagram, where she posts short videos with tips on building Ukrainian vocabulary and improving speaking skills. And she says business is booming, to say the very least. We can see it in the statistics too. Since the beginning of the invasion, the everyday usage of Russian language in Ukraine notably decreased from 33% in 2021 to 23% in 2022. And remember that statistic about 40% of Ukrainians claiming Russian as their mother tongue in 2012? A recent poll from the Ukrainian Institute found that in 2022, only 16% of Ukrainians now have it as their native language. In terms of business, data from job search platform Work.ua showed employers posted 84% of vacancies in Ukrainian and 13% in Russian at the end of 2022, while in 2015 it was nearly the opposite. 16% of vacancies were in Ukrainian and 80% in Russian. Even when comparing a bit more recent data, the number of Ukrainians who use Ukrainian exclusively or most of the time in their everyday life increased from 49% in 2017 to 58% in 2022. While the corresponding number for Russians dropped from 26% to 15%, according to the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. But perhaps even more alarming for Putin and Russia, not only is the Russian language being dropped, but it won't even be passed on as much to the next generation as it usually is, or now was. Many Ukrainians, out of disgust for Russia, will raise their children to speak only Ukrainian, even though it's not their native language. This is where the true death of Russian may be seen, in the following decades. And I haven't even spoken about the new laws that have been passed. While before there was a decommunization, now there's a de-Russification. It's the same thing as before, with many streets, signs, and statues being changed. Like this Mother Ukraine statue, with this before and after, for example. But it's gotten a lot more severe. At the end of June 2022, the Odessa region and the city of Mykolaiv removed Russian from their school curriculum, while in September of that same year, Ukraine's biggest banks removed Russian from their mobile applications and websites. Monobank, with 7 million retail clients, updated its app to Ukrainian only. On November 10th of 2022, the Kiev City Council completely excluded the Russian language from being taught as part of the curriculum in preschool and general secondary education. They also eventually banned the public use of Russian language books, music, performances, concerts, art albums, and other media in the Ukrainian capital. Nationwide, the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine decided to remove more than 40 works by Soviet and Russian authors from school textbooks. And the more costly this war continues to get, the more likely that Russian will get repealed even more. In the end, it seems like this invasion is the final straw in the coffin of Russian in Ukrainian. It seems like it survived the 2005 Orange Revolution and the 2014 Euromaidan, but this may very well be it. And although it may seem extreme, it makes sense. Ukraine is once and for all trying to finally break free of the Russian influence and language that seems to continue to haunt it. Only time will tell though if all these measures work, or if Ukraine is just too deeply connected historically to completely drop the language. Thank you for watching.